Hi, my name is Miss Amber, and I'm here today with your English 12B live lesson. Now, today, our lesson is going to be from Unit 2, Lesson number 5 on Victorian drama. This one shouldn't be too long. We should be able to get through it relatively quickly, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Here we go. Move myself up into the corner. And so pretty much Victorian drama means like theater plays and things like that. Whenever you see drama in any of these lessons, that's basically what they are referring to. So we start off here with slide number 5. And just to give you a summary of stuff that's here, they basically talk about how the theater was part of the nightlife of the Victorian era. Now, if you don't remember from some of the previous lessons, the Victorian era followed and developed during the Industrial Revolution. So this is when we get the middle class that exists in Britain, and people who made money finally started having free time to read, to seek out lots of art and leisurely things. So this is the culture where drama sort of thrived. Now it says here, the urban social scene of London included a variety of entertainment options such as private clubs, restaurants, cafes, and casinos. And attending the theater was also a popular pastime. So they were able to go ahead and watch different types of plays, listen to symphonies, people playing music at the time, and watch ballet. And then they give you a little background on it. At the beginning of Queen Victoria's reign, which is the Victorian era, when it started, actors and theater people were not viewed well, pretty much, because the background of plays and how they developed were originally religious in nature, but then people started doing spin-offs of religious plays and changing the content that was in them to be not about moral or church related things. So a lot of the actors and plays and theater related stuff had a reputation for being immoral and sometimes uneducated, especially if they weren't very specifically related to the church. It got so bad to the point where Puritans were pretty much opposed to anyone doing plays anywhere that weren't specifically like morality plays, which were the types that the church put on. If you recall from some earlier lessons, the Puritans actually burned down the very first theater. The very first theater that actors used, actually. There's some information about this in some of the other courses. If you are coming from English 12A, then you might remember this information. The Globe was the stage and theater that was built and pioneered by William Shakespeare. He did a lot of his plays there. And they ended up having to move it at some point. And then like later on, after like 30 years of being able to do performances in it, it was burned down specifically by Puritans who felt like it was immoral and an insult to God and religion to continue doing plays. So during the Renaissance, that's the period where William Shakespeare made theater popular. There had to be people to bring plays and drama into the limelight for people to appreciate it. And in the Victorian realm, there were playwrights and people who were performing plays that had to do the exact same thing during this time. So basically, if someone wrote great plays, then it became popular with people and people wanted to see them. But if no one is around to sort of give playwrights, plays and performances a good name, people who were religious tried to basically downsell it as something awful. So they give you, they basically just say here, a new batch of playwrights and actors brought greater legitimacy to the theater. And there's some text from our earlier lessons on the Victorian era where we learned that people had to actually advocate for art performances and things like that so that people could understand that it had value during this time. So the theater, acting, and plays were definitely one of these things. It says here, gradually, the social stigma began to fade, and still middle-class actors rarely achieve the status of the wealthy characters that they portrayed on stage. They're letting you know that there's definitely a difference between the lifestyle of the people that were played on the stage versus what actors were able to do at the time. Now we move on to slide 6, and they talk about how there was a revitalization of the comedy of manners. So this type of comedy first flourished during the 17th century. So doing the math, that I've mentioned this in a couple other lessons, you subtract 1 from the number they give you, which is 17, and then add double zeros to the end. So this is the 1600s. And usually dealt with complex behavioral codes in wealthy circles. So basically they would make fun of people who were super wealthy and all of the codes that they had to do to be considered high class. And it says here, in most cases, the shallowest characters triumphed in the end, and their comedic aspect came from the witty dialogue and wordplay. So they're giving you the definition of the comedy of manners right here. So in your notes, this is what you're going to want to put down. You can, note that it flourished or became popular in the 16th century. You can put, 17th century, you can put 1600s in parentheses there. And they give you the definition of it. They revolved around romance, greed, and social status. The shallowest characters triumphed in the end, and the comedic or funny aspect came from witty dialogue and wordplay. Now here at the bottom, they tell you that a Victorian playwright named Oscar Wilde, you may have heard his name before, he's pretty famous. If you haven't, don't sweat it, no worries. He was inspired by the comedy of manners, and he basically began to write plays featuring a lot of humor and sarcasm because he was inspired by these plays. So Oscar Wilde is who we're going to be focused on for this lesson. So let's see. Slide 9 starts to give you information about Oscar Wilde. So there's a picture of him here, and they give you information about him as an author. Now remember that knowing about the author gives you information on the importance of basically the background and how it influenced him as a person, because what people write is usually very much based on what was going on during the time that they were growing up. So they let you know he was born in Dublin, so he's Irish in 1854. And just to go through some of the highlights from this slide, he didn't limit himself to writing plays. He wrote reviews, he edited a women's magazine, he published a collection of poetry, and he did a lot of other things. He did children's stories, he wrote a novel. He was kind of like spread out a lot in terms of what he wrote and what he published. He's mostly remembered for being a playwright though. So he's got all these other things. You can probably find them at your local library if you're interested in looking at how he used wit and sarcasm in his works. But for the most part, he's known for being a funny and sarcastic playwright. Specifically, they let you know that he's known for his witty dialogue and unique style. So dialogue, if you remember correctly, is the words that are exchanged between characters in a play. So dialogue is when someone says something, that's dialogue. In a story, lines where characters speak, that's what it is. So his dialogue was considered witty. So there were jokes, puns, and things like that. And he liked to play with words a lot when he wrote out what characters would say. He's also remembered for his famous public persona and flashy style, they tell you here at the bottom. He expressed his individuality by growing out his hair long, which wasn't like considered a bad thing at the time, but it was considered not typical. He wore a lot of colorful clothes, and he was pretty expressive and not like very reserved and conservative. He also challenged a lot of Victorian beliefs about gender dress and public behavior, just in terms of what's considered masculine. He pretty much just did what he wanted to do, dressed the way he wanted to dress. You can see here in this picture here, he's not just wearing like a normal sort of like pea coat. He's got his own staff. He's got like these big bold fur cuffs on his sleeves, the big lapel. Like he was kind of out there for what was considered proper at the time. Okay. So they give you a little more information about what he did in his writing. He challenged the popular Victorian belief that artists should use their work as a call for social reform. As a supporter of aestheticism, Wilde believed that the artist's sole responsibility was the creation of beauty. So aestheticism, if you look at this word right here, and we break it down, aesthetic is the beginning of this word. So aesthetic is when things look good, when things are beautiful. That's the root word of aesthetic. It's appealing to people. It is a visual appeal to people. So so the belief of aestheticism is that people exist to do things or to make things that are beautiful. So that's what he thought the artist's responsibility was. Your goal is to make art, not necessarily to push a political issue. And there are different groups of artists that feel different ways. Some people feel that art is an expression of society. Some people push back on that and says, hey, you can do that. But I think that art is supposed to remind people of what's beautiful in the world or what's good in the world or what's funny in the world. So there are different groups of artists that have different points of view. And Oscar Wilde specifically thought that the artist's responsibility was the creation of beauty. It says here that his major contribution to Victorian society is the development of a stock character called the dandy. Now, dandy is a word that we throw around today, and it basically originated with this guy. So it says here in Wilde's plays, a dandy is an overdressed, philosophizing character who often speaks in riddles. Dandies are always men, and they are portrayed as trivial, shallow, and obsessed with other people's perceptions. Now, today, dandies are a little different. Dandies are viewed as people who dress upscale and sophisticated. So they were able to kind of hold on to that sort of shallow perception part of it, but they usually don't philosophize as much these days. There's a little more emphasis on dandy as a look instead of a personality. But when Wilde was writing and when he first came up with this, he used the idea of a dandy, like someone that talks big but cares a lot more about what people think of him, to basically argue against people who cared about looking like they were moral and doing the right thing instead of actually being good. It says here, yep, he used the stock character to attack the fake morality and superficiality he saw in Victorian society. The term dandy quickly made its way into the Victorian lexicon. In everyday conversation, the word was used to describe flamboyant men, including Wilde himself. So that's the definition that's stuck at the end. So this paragraph should be in your notes because dandy is a character stereotype that we can still come across today, depending on what you are reading. Okay. So they give you the introduction to the reading selection for today, which is the importance of being earnest. So they tell you it was an instant success, and it's one of Wilde's most widely recognized works. So usually if you talk to someone who studied English or who has studied the Victorian era and you bring up Oscar Wilde, this is what they're going to think of first. It was a pretty famous work. It's been criticized over the years for having a weak plot, so that means like a weak story. But it's considered basically like the embodiment, it says here, quintessential Victorian comedy of manners. So it's like, if you need an example of what Victorian comedy of manners was like, this is it. This is the number one example. Once you see it, you have a pretty strong idea of what the rest of them were like. So this is the one that represents most of the comedy of manners from this era. It says, for many, The weak plot is overshadowed by Wilde's skillful use of wit and sarcasm. So what they're telling you in this paragraph is when you read the excerpt from The Importance of Being Earnest, what they want you to remember is that this has a weak story. You're supposed to pay attention a little more to what the characters say, how they say it, and if it's funny. And then they give you more information about it. The Importance of Being Earnest seems like a typical carefree comedy. However, insightful and pointed social commentary lies just below the surface. So you have to pay attention, again, like I said, to what people are saying and how they're saying things. It says many of Wilde's characters are driven by strict but hollow codes of social conduct. And over the course of the play, it becomes clear that the wealthy characters use these behavioral codes to maintain their status relative to other members of society. So they're using the behavioral codes to stay on top, basically. They think it's more important to act like you have money and status than to be a good person and be considered of high status for those reasons. So it says the Importance of Being Earnest is a humorous and thought-provoking social commentary that entertains readers today. Now, being earnest means being basically steadfast, being eager, but also honest. So like enthusiastic in a trustworthy, straightforward kind of way. So there's already irony in the title of this play because they've told you in the second paragraph here that a lot of the characters are just doing things to be held up to a high societal standard. So they're already not really being earnest. So the title of the play itself gives you an idea of some of the sarcasm that you're going to find here. Now, as per usual, I don't read excerpts. If you are having issues with the excerpt, you should schedule a tutoring session, or feel free to ask your advocate or mentor with help with it as well. But I am going to go through some of the information on the next couple slides, just so that you have a little bit of information about what you're going to encounter here. So the title, they say, basically gives you the plot. To be earnest means to be sincere or serious in intention, purpose, or effort, straightforward, hardworking, enthusiastic. So they give you the name of the protagonist, Jack Worthing, and he experiences a series of events that teach him the importance of being earnest. It's in quotations. But the play isn't just that simple. There's more to it than just, oh, this guy learned some lessons. Wilde toys with the word earnest. And I mean, I feel like you can sort of read the summary and kind of guess that this is what's going to happen. So he gives you other people's definition of earnest based on how they behave for you to like compare with what the main character is doing and trying to learn. Miss Prim and Cicely Cardew, these are two female characters, they want to marry men who are named Ernest. Ironically, the male characters' behaviors are far from earnest. So you see, we've already got wordplay. They want to marry men named Ernest, but the play is about being earnest. And the characters that they meet, the men that they meet, are very far from earnest. And the irony here is that they lie and pretend to be named Ernest because they know that's what these women are looking for. So there's just a lot of missed connections, missed understandings, people trying to deceive one another. And the main character learning from watching these things unfold. So in terms of the summary of the plot, I'm not going to give away the whole thing. This slide pretty much gives you the entire summary of the actual play from start to finish. So I do think that you should pause to read, especially because we haven't gone over the excerpt. It's still important for you to read the excerpt from the play. There are going to be questions on the mastery test on specifically what you read. They're going to give you quotes and things like that. But this plot summary pretty much rolls it together for you. If you read that excerpt and you're having trouble understanding what has happened in the play, this is going to be a very good follow-up for you reading that. If you know that you're going to have a rough time understanding it, like say you opened it up while we were in the middle of this video and you're like, oh no, I don't know if I can understand this phrasing. I do think it's a good idea to read these summaries first, then go back to the excerpt and read. That way you're covered on both bases. You have the explanation, you can follow along with what is happening, but you also get to read the actual quotes and things from the play so that when you get questions on these on the mastery test, you won't be struggling with them. But they pretty much spell it out here. If there's anything that you don't understand while you are reading the excerpt, you'll probably get your question answered here. But basically, just to highlight a couple things that happen in this play. Jack Worthing, that's the main character we just talked about, is an upstanding citizen in the country of Hertfordshire. We get some information on his background, and he wants to escape some of his responsibilities. So he fabricates a story about a brother who is in constant need of help. And when he is in the city, he takes on the identity of the relative. So basically he makes up a brother who needs help. And then he uses it as an excuse to go into the city. And when he's in the city, he keeps his real identity a secret and goes by the name of Ernest. So he meets a bunch of people while he's being Ernest in the city and gets into some discussions and situations with them. And that's basically how the story unfolds. This video here, slide 17, gives you even more information about the play if the summary is not enough from the last slide. This video is specifically about the themes and the importance of being Ernest. So they go over what the themes are, and they give you examples of where they happen in the play. So between the plot summary that they gave you, the primer that you got before you were actually reading the excerpt, and this, you should be all set. If you open up the excerpt and it's overwhelming for you, you should definitely be able to watch this video, go back and reread the excerpt. If you've done all of those things and you're still having a hard time, please reach out to a tutor so that we can go over the excerpt with you bit by bit, and you can get that one-on-one engagement. Because sometimes it's hard, even when you're reading modern stuff. I totally understand. But I just want to let you know that sometimes it makes sense to go through the extra information they give you about the excerpt and then go back to read it so that you know what to expect and you can help put the pieces together for yourself. Okay. Now, what I am going to go through is the literary devices that you're going to encounter here, because I think it's important for you to be able to point them out when you are reading the excerpt. So just in case you missed any of this while you were in the excerpt, or you just want to look ahead to know what to expect before reading. Mostly this is about satire. So satire, the definition of satire, they give it to you here. Satire is the use of irony, sarcasm, and other literary devices to expose or make fun of something. So to understand satire, you have to know what irony is, you have to know what sarcasm is, and you have to know other literary devices, but mostly we're going to focus on irony and sarcasm. So most people know what sarcasm is. Irony is what most people mistake sarcasm for, right? So irony is when you do or say the opposite of what you mean or what is expected. There are 3 types of irony, count them 3. We're going to go through them really quick. There's verbal irony. That is when you say the opposite of what you mean. An example would be, you walk outside, you see it's raining. Oh, wow, isn't this just lovely weather? You're saying the opposite of what you mean for emphasis. So that's irony. That's verbal irony when you say it. There is situational irony. That's number 2. Situational irony is when the situation that characters are in or that happens in a story end up the opposite way that anyone expects. So basically there's a twist in the story. The audience doesn't know. The people who are in the story don't know. It's all a surprise to everyone. The third type is dramatic irony. Dramatic irony is specifically for plays, so this is what's relevant to this lesson. But dramatic irony is when the audience knows information that the characters on stage or in the story don't know. So you're reading the book, you're watching the play, you see the signs. You know that the opposite of what the characters expect is going to happen. And you're stuck waiting for them to get in the situation to realize what's going on or to fall victim to the trap or whatever it is that's going on. So just to review, verbal irony is when you say the opposite of what you mean. Situational irony is when the opposite of what everyone expects to happen happens. And dramatic irony is when the audience knows the opposite thing is about to happen, but the characters don't. So Wilde uses irony to illustrate the absurdity of certain social conventions. Now, he does this through verbal irony because his characters often say the opposite of what's true or expected. And then I give you a quote that's an example of this. Algernon says, in married life, 3 is company and 2 is none. Now, 3 is company sounds like, at first you're like, yeah, but then you're like, hold on, wait. It's supposed to be 2 is company, 3 is a crowd. So why would he have his character say this? He had his character say this on purpose because what his character's actually saying is that what he thinks is that most people often wanted a third person around in their marriages, especially in the Victorian era, because they didn't like their spouses. People married more for status than they did because of feelings or emotions or because people got along well or loved each other. So they often wanted a third person around because they couldn't stand the person that they were married to. So that's an example of how he uses irony in these plays. He has characters say the opposite of what anyone would expect and do the opposite of what they say they're going to do. Now, we also get to examine a couple other different literary devices that he uses. So the first thing they cover here on slide 20 is paradox. So they give you the definition of a paradox. A paradox is a statement that seems contradictory or absurd, but actually expresses a possible truth. So a paradoxical statement calls into question the actual meaning of what's being said. So whereas you can miss irony. So like if someone says the opposite of what they mean and it goes over your head, you can think that they mean what they're saying. But a paradox is said in a way that's supposed to be extreme so that you notice there's something wrong with it. So the example they give you is Algernon saying, divorces are made in heaven. So you hear the word divorce and you hear the word heaven and you're like, what? What? How? What does this mean? It's a play on the phrase a match made in heaven. But what he's trying to say is that most people are so unhappy in their marriages that divorce actually makes people happier. And when you think about it, you're like, most people get divorces because they actually want to get divorces. So yeah, maybe it is actually made in heaven. And it's that phrase that's supposed to make you think. This is not irony because he's not saying the opposite of what he means. Divorces are made in heaven is very definitive. He's saying divorces are a good thing. But it sounds like two opposites coming together, and that's what makes it a paradox. Okay, so on slide 21, we get information about sarcasm and we get the definition of sarcasm, okay? So most people kind of mix up what irony and sarcasm is because they're related. But sarcasm is when you use biting or cutting language to convey scorn or ridicule. Now, basically, scorn or ridicule is like making fun of someone, insulting someone. Most people use irony to insult people. They'll say the opposite of what they mean to be mean to someone. So they're combining sarcasm and irony together, but they are not actually the same thing. You can say something ironically without the intention of being mean to someone specifically. Sarcasm is when you are actually being mean. And then they give you an excerpt here which is basically two women who are having a conversation. And even though it sounds like they're being polite, they're secretly insulting each other. They dislike each other. They're using sarcasm here to insult each other while they're pretending to be polite. And it also reveals that even though they're saying the polite things, it doesn't really mean anything because they don't like each other. What's the point of being polite if you're just using it to be mean to someone? You know, that's the point that he's making in these plays. And that's kind of the point of him making these plays in the first place, to comment on how dishonest people are, even while they're telling you to your face that they're being honest. Now on slide 22, we get one last one. So we get puns. So puns are a little difficult to define because they're kind of broad. They're like a big idea. But they give you a definition here. You can put this in your notes to try to help you remember. It says, in the broadest sense, a pun is a phrase that purposefully exaggerates confusion between similar words. So basically, you're making a joke about two words that sound the same or that have a similar meaning. You're specifically using the fact that they have similar sounds to make the joke. It says the most common type of pun makes use of different denotations. Denotations are dictionary definitions of the same word. So they basically make a joke based on the fact that one word has two different meanings. That's the most common type of pun. So it says these puns have two levels of meaning, they explain. The first is the literal meaning of the word in context, and the second is the understanding of the word outside of the context. So if you know that a word has more than one definition, then when other people make a joke about using that word for a meaning that doesn't make any sense, you can get the joke. So they show a joke about dentists here as an example. It says it is very vulgar to talk like a dentist when one isn't a dentist. It produces a false impression. And then Algernon says, well, that is exactly what dentists always do. Now, they're basically what they're doing is making fun of the meanings of the words false and impression. So Jack says, one should not talk like a dentist if one isn't a dentist because it produces a false impression. So what he says, what he means when he says that is that it's like lying. So like if you talk like a dentist when you're not one, you're lying. But it says, you know, a person shouldn't be a person that is not. But Algernon makes the pun that dentists are in the business of false impressions, because false impressions is another phrase for fake teeth. When you get teeth made for your mouth, different sets and stuff, you have to mold those sets to your gums. So you are making an impression of your mouth on the denture so they can be made. So that's a type of fake teeth. So that's the pun that he's using there. Now, this was definitely considered funny at the time. It's a little less funny now with the false impressions. But there are other types of puns that I'm sure you guys come across in children's films and stuff like that all the time. Now here they just give you more information about puns. They let you know that this was very important to the Victorians during this era. Victorians greatly admired a playwright's ability to devise ridiculous puns. Wilde was widely regarded as one of the best. In some cases, characters make puns on purpose, and in other cases, the pun goes unrecognized by the speaker. So because he wrote plays, sometimes his characters would make puns by accident that was supposed to be amusing to you as the person watching the play, basically is what they're saying. And then they give you an example on this slide. And then it says, of course, one pun appears and reappears throughout the play. So they give you this example, which is, it isn't Ernest, it's Jack. And then it says, you have always told me it was Ernest. I've introduced you to everyone as Ernest. You answer to the name Ernest. You look as if your name was Ernest. You are the most earnest looking person I ever saw in my life. So this is the most obvious pun, right? This is the one that you can get just by looking at the name of the play. The importance of being earnest sounds like the name Ernest. It's spelled the way the word is in the title, So this is the thing that gets mixed up the most during this play. Earnest the person and earnest the word, and how that relates to people and how they behave. So that's just the biggest pun. And they give you an example of when it actually comes up here in this play. I just read it. And it just says, the humor in the pun is that most of the play's characters believe it's better to be named Ernest than it is to be an earnest person. As discussed earlier, to be earnest is to be sincere, serious, and disciplined. And some Victorian thinkers, such as Lord Tennyson and Matthew Arnold, upheld the trait as ideal. But others mocked it as a pointless obsession with rigid morality. So basically, he's trying to point out there are people who think that being earnest, the actual quality of a person being sincere and serious, is actually important. It's important to be this type of person. But what Wilde is pointing out is that people are pretending to be earnest so they can feel good about being good people. And that they're so obsessed with looking and being earnest that they're not actually being earnest. And that's kind of the joke of the play, since Jack is pretending to be earnest when he's in the city. That's basically the whole point of the play, to show the confusion between how people treat being earnest in real life through a person who is pretending to be someone named Ernest. That's the joke there. Okay, so now that you've got all of this under your belt, make sure you go back and read the excerpt if you haven't already. If you've already read it, hopefully this explanation helped put some things together for you. You might need to read it again. And if you're having issues, remember, call for tutoring. I think this is about it. There's a writing assignment, and then we're at the end of the lesson. So I'm going to stop sharing. I just want to remind you that the tutors are there for help. You can schedule tutoring if you need it. If you just have a quick question, just email the English department at english@atsedu.net and contact us there. You'll get an answer back within 24 hours. And if you need some one-on-one, there's nothing wrong with that. And I think that that's about it for this one. This lesson was pretty short and kind of self-explanatory. There was no fancy old language in here or anything like that. So this is me, Miss Amber, signing off. And good luck with the rest of your English class.